Okay, everyone, hello. We have a full house here at the Harvard Law Forum, our opening event for the Harvard Law Forum of this year. I am Pete Davis, a 3L here at the law school and the chair of the Harvard Law Forum. Just to let you know about us, we're the longest running American law school speaker series. I'm proud to say we are the only Harvard Law School organization that has hosted JFK, Jimmy Carter, Thurgood Marshall, Ralph Nader, Eleanor Roosevelt, Ebert and Roper, Jerry Falwell, Cesar Chavez, Timothy Leary, the inventor of LSD, Sally Ride, the astronaut, Fidel Castro, and wrestling magnate Vince McMahon in events. As far as I know, the Harvard Law Review has yet to top that. As chair, I am focusing the Harvard Law Forum on our law school's mission statement, which is rarely discussed here, but let me remind you, the mission statement is to educate leaders who contribute to the advancement of justice and the well-being of society. We want speakers who inspire us to not just monetize our law degrees in service of the wealthy and powerful few, but rather to deploy them to address the important legal crises of the many today. And I'd like to explain why I invited Matt Stoller to be with us today. It starts back in the late 1980s. In the late 1980s, the John M. Olin Foundation, funded by a fortune amassed from chemical and munitions manufacturing, spent $68 million to underwrite 83% of the costs for all law and economics programs in American law schools. Here's a quote from Olin trustee James Pearson to the New York Times, quote, "I saw it as a way into the law schools. I probably shouldn't confess this," but then he confessed it. "But economic analysis tends to have conservatizing effects. If you said to a dean you wanted conservative constitutional law, he would reject the idea out of hand. But if you said you wanted to support law and economics, he would be much more open to the idea. Law and economics is neutral, but it has a philosophical thrust in the direction of limited government." That's a direct quote from the Olin Foundation about their funding of law schools. And in their book, Agenda Setting, A Wise Giver's Guide to Influencing Public Policy, they really shared it in the title, the right-wing philanthropy roundtable cites Olin's donation to which law school? Harvard Law School, as one of the foundation's, quote, savviest interventions. The foundation offered to fund a new program in law and economics with a multi-year grant. Harvard President Derek Bok leaped at the offer. The HLS-based John M. Olin Center for Law, Economics, and Business eventually received more than $18 million from the Olin Foundation, and it was, quote, a smashing success. By 2005, the number of Harvard faculty whose central interests could be defined within the sphere of law and economics had jumped to 23. 4 dozen alumni are at other top law schools. A few decades after these initial donations, political scientist Stephen Tellez said, "This legal ideology best aligned with corporate interests had rapidly moved from marginal insurgency to hegemony. There is no comparable level of funding used to intervene in legal thought on the side of less funded and less organized, yet more populated groups, such as, say, workers, consumers, tenants, prisoners, and everyday victims of torts." And a glaring example of this legal inequality is antitrust. And while our school community stands by, the consolidation of firms into monopolistic giants that threaten our democracy is entrenched by a revolving door between antitrust regulators and corporate interest law firms. As an example, 4 of the Obama administration's assistant attorneys general for antitrust, the Obama administration's assistant attorney generals for antitrust and DOJ have left to join corporate interest law firms that represent clients regulated by their former department. Today, we have a man helping spearhead an organization, the Open Markets Institute, that is designed to speak for the citizen on this question. He was a senior policy advisor to the Senate Budget Committee on trade, competition policy, and financial services. His amazing writing has appeared in The Atlantic, The New York Times, The New Republic, and The Nation. He is a hit on Twitter, representing what some may call, I don't know if he calls himself this, but some may call the Justice Brandeis wing of the century-old progressive debate between nationalizing big business, regulating big business, or breaking up big business. Brandeis called on young lawyers to, quote, do a great work for this country and give adequate legal expression to, quote, the aspirations of the people. Here to help us do that, the great Matt Stoller.
What an introduction. That was really impressive. I actually kind of just want to listen to you for an hour. No, that was really remarkable, and you really captured kind of the themes of what I'm going to talk about today. So this lecture is called is about the platforms. So Google, Facebook. I'm going to throw in Amazon, and then what it means to be a lawyer. But I'm going to start with a story. So it's about a parent named Michael Turk. And this is a guy that I used to argue with, not on Twitter, but about 10 years ago, 15 years ago in the blogs. We used to argue about net neutrality. He was a libertarian Republican and a telecom guy and very good at IT. But he's also a dad. And he has teenage sons now. And one of his sons is addicted to his computer. So he plays video games and goes to these online hangouts and watches YouTube. It's not uncommon for this kind of addiction to happen. I mean, our brains are wired to respond to the kind of stimulus that electronics produces. It's kind of similar to slot machines in casinos, the way that it gives pulses of pleasure to the brain. And Google has thousands of engineers. Silicon Valley companies have engineers and that use psychological tricks to try to keep us using their products so that they can divert our attention and sell it to advertisers. It's called the attention economy. It works on all of our brains, but it's especially dangerous to children. So Mike went into his son's machine and said, I'm going to block these products that he's using. And so he just went in and he blocked all the various websites. And then he tested it, and they were all blocked except YouTube. And he types in YouTube, and it pops up. So he's like, this is strange. And then he noticed that it was the Chrome browser. And the Chrome browser is made by Google. So he does a number of other things, and then eventually he just can't figure out how to block YouTube from Chrome. So he just deletes Chrome, and he says, I'm going to install a different browser. And he realizes his kid will just download a new version of Chrome if he lets him go to google.com. So he blocks all Google products from this different browser. But then he realizes that his son can't do his homework without Google. Not because he can't use a different search engine, but because the school has a deal with Google, and they use Google products to interact in terms of homework. So he filed a complaint with the FTC, and he said, Google has too much power. This is a libertarian Republican asking the government for help. Now, he kind of mocked me because of what the FTC responded with, but the basic point remains. There is a weird sort of libertarian notion about platforms, about us as consumers to choose our fate. So if you don't like Facebook, if you don't like Google, if you don't like Amazon, don't use them, right? You don't want them to have your data, log off, right? You hear this all the time. But if you think you can avoid these institutions, think about Mike's story. Google interposed itself between a parent and a child through its vertical integration of products and then into the school system itself. And that's just a consumer story. Right? Google, Facebook collect data in all sorts of places that you go to. You are using their products even if you don't know you're using their products. They are shaping a whole set of industries that you use, and that's true for Amazon as well. But on a consumer level, you can't avoid them. Now, there is no clear definition of what a monopoly is, but I like the one that Brandeis used. He said that a monopoly is a unified control of some recognized branch of trade or service. So let's look at these platforms. Google has 88% of the search market. Facebook has 77% of mobile social networking traffic. 2/3 of American adults are on Facebook, and 43% of them say that social networks are there where they often get their news. Amazon has 74% of the ebooks market. Facebook and Google captured virtually all the growth in online advertising last year, and Amazon took more than half of all online sales growth last year. So these are not just monopolies. They have control of these branches of trade and service. And not just any branches of trade, but access to information and news, financing of media, the structuring of our social relationships in our political discourse, and books, the vessel for ideas. This is the lifeblood of democracy and ideas. That's what they're controlling. So beyond just whether they're monopolies, they're really big and powerful. Google has 7 products with more than 1 billion users. Facebook has bragged about how it boosted voter turnout. And at one point in 2014, the company did an experiment on about 1 million users to see if they could manipulate their emotions and make them feel happy or sad, and they could. A few years ago, I think this is my favorite one, Amazon just created a holiday. That's like Prime Day, right? That's really weird. It's like, who can say, I'm going to create a holiday? Like Jeff Bezos can, and he did. And it actually changed GDP growth. It shifted consumer spending patterns. 3 times as many CEOs on an earnings call mentioned Amazon than Trump. So these companies, they're the pace setters in our economy, in our culture, and in our politics. They also have political power. So Sheryl Sandberg was in DC last week talking to politicians about Facebook in Russia, at the same time as Facebook was scrubbing access to data that analysts were using to see what happened on their platform. That's political power. Amazon is quietly taking over DoD procurement. That was in the defense authorization bill this year. We'll see what happens with trade. Jeff Bezos owns the Washington Post. Now, my group, Open Markets, was a part of a think tank called New America. And a couple of months ago, we were kicked out because of Google's influence or perceived influence over these institutions in DC. You can just look. Google has a transparency page. Every nonprofit in DC and around the country, and even globally, is on their payroll. Everyone on the right, from like Cato, Heritage Foundation, to groups on the left, the Center for American Progress, NAACP, the American Librarian Association. They bought off the librarians. Librarians are great, but they take Google money. That's political power, and they use it. And I think our example was the exertion of that power. Now, having institutions with this much power over the free flow of information in our society is actually a radical change for our country. So if you want to talk about breaking up these platforms, as I do, you have to actually start with understanding the scale of the changes that have already happened. These platforms have not taken over everything, but they are very powerful and they are on their way. So I'm working on a book on monopoly power in the 20th century. So I'm going to jump around a little bit from the 30s to the 70s to the platforms of 2017. And I'm not going to lay out an exact recipe for what to do about each of these platforms. They're all very big and complex institutions, and they need to be handled very carefully. But I'm going to lay out some broad principles. More than that, I want to lay out, I want to help you understand why we need to break up these institutions and what that actually means politically. Because breaking up Google, Facebook, Amazon is shorthand for something else. It's shorthand for fitting these institutions into our constitutional order, fitting them into our democracy. While the technical solutions get very complex, the fundamental point here is actually pretty simple. We either live in a democracy where we as a free people govern our cultural and commercial institutions, or we do not live in a democracy, and those institutions and the people behind them govern us. Mark Zuckerberg understands this. They all actually understand this. So he brought in early on Sheryl Sandberg, who was chief of staff to Larry Summers at Treasury in the 90s, where she worked on derivatives deregulation and repeal of Glass-Steagall. And they used to talk about her experience in government. And Zuckerberg said this, quote, in a lot of ways, Facebook is more like a government than a traditional company. We have this large community of people, and more than any other technology companies, we're really setting policies. So he sees Facebook as a government, and that's a reasonable way to see it. He also has an ideology. So this is what he said before, I guess, the PR people got a hold of him. Quote, the days of you having a different image for your work friends or coworkers and for the other people you know are probably coming to an end pretty quickly. Having 2 identities for yourself is an example of a lack of integrity. Now you may agree with this framework, or you may not. But it is actually a very profound view of how people should run their lives. And Zuckerberg has a vision, which a lot of people have crazy visions, but he also has the means to achieve it. So he's seeking not just to run a business, but to actually rule in some ways. Is that something you're comfortable with? Should Mark Zuckerberg be setting the structures by which we organize our elections, our social discourse, our financing of art, of news, of culture and entertainment? Should he be organizing the rules by which we structure our very identities? Should he be doing this not just for America, but for Denmark, for Japan, for Kenya? So corporate structures overwhelming democracy is not a new problem, though it is new in our lifetimes. We've seen it before. The founding of the country was really, we saw it then with the protest against the British East Indies Company. But to take an analogy that's more comparable, it's kind of what the New Dealers faced in the 1930s. So in the 20s, there were these giant financial holding companies, you know the names, J.P. Morgan, Standard Oil, the DuPonts, the Mellons, and they controlled significant chunks of American politics, banking, and commerce. One of them, Andrew Mellon, was even Secretary of the Treasury. So when the stock market crashed and the banking system crashed, it turns out the system that these titans had organized was fragile and corrupt. And the president in charge, Herbert Hoover, the great engineer, wouldn't or couldn't do anything about the starvation and the unemployment that these titans caused. And it wasn't obvious that democracy was up to the task of rebuilding our society and taking power from these monopolists, from these financial titans. So in 1932, when Roosevelt was running, he made this explicit. He said the task of government in its relation to business is to assist the development of an economic declaration of rights, an economic constitutional order. And he talked about the financial titans and said that at first they might have been good, bringing new technologies like the railroad, the telegraph, oil, steel, telephone. But in 1932, with the economy in ruins, he said, the day of the great promoter, the financial titan to whom we granted anything if only he would build or develop is over. A lot of analogies there. And it was. So there's a lot of new details about the New Deal, but the shorthand is this. The structure of American politics and business was organized from roughly the 1870s until the 20s by a narrow group of financial holding companies. And then in a few years, that was taken apart by the New Deal. Now, one difference between the New Deal and today is that the idea of corporations taking over politics today doesn't really make that much sense. It's sort of science fiction-y type of thing. But it wasn't true back then. In 1932, when Roosevelt was running, liberal democracy was not the undisputed political ideology. When people looked around the world, they saw France and England, which were democracies but were pretty weak. There were protests where unemployed people were throwing bricks at Parliament. They saw Italy, Soviet Union, Germany, Japan, Spain. These were ugly alternatives to democracy where economic power as well as political power was concentrated. So they pursued a program that was an attack on these concentrated financial structures because they believed, or many of them believed, that these were just political machines that were opposed to democracy itself. And New Dealers used the law, many things, but they used the law to take these systems apart. And that's how we have to see our regulatory agencies and administrative state. So, I can go through the litany of New Deal laws, but there were also a lot of congressional investigations. There were government-financed industrial projects. They put people on trial. Often they lost, but they tried. They kept trying. So the New Deal was a means of seizing power from these financial titans and decentralizing it to the people. And that's what breaking up industrial titans meant, at least in the New Deal. And there's a bunch of interesting things that I'm finding. For example, a bunch of New Dealers actually helped create Silicon Valley with some antitrust suits. But the point is this. We've seen this kind of problem before. And in order to take on Facebook, Google, and Amazon, and also the systems that they represent, because they didn't come out of nowhere, we're going to need to do what the New Dealers did. So let's talk about the difference between how New Dealers organize their thinking versus how current politicians do, and current citizens, actually. So you guys are aware, I'm assuming, of Equifax and the breach, right? So the CEO, he resigns, and he gets a $90 million retirement bonus. Sorry, my paper fell. I guess you'll have to, oh, it went under the desk. Equifax's reach is everywhere. So I don't care if that was a pity laugh, I'll take it. So Wells Fargo keeps apologizing to Congress. And well, for like committing fraud, which apparently is, the penalty is you have to apologize. In 2010, JP Morgan started this apology-based legal system by apologizing to Congress for illegally foreclosing on active duty service members, which carries a 1-year term in prison per violation. And this is also, I don't think this is in statute, but it is, you just have to say you're sorry. And the official in charge of not prosecuting is actually the chair of the DNC, Tom Perez, who was at DOJ in charge of this law then. But don't worry, because he also didn't prosecute Steve Mnuchin, whose bank, One West, had 55 cases of violations of the same law. And I could go on down the list of remarkable accretions of private power that are destroying our country and destroying, in a lot of ways, political stability. We have a legal heroin epidemic. It's peddled by the billionaire Sackler family of Purdue Pharmaceuticals. Between 90 and 130 Americans are dying a day. But don't worry, because if you're in DC, you can stop by the Sackler Museum. It's a Smithsonian, and it's lovely. Puerto Rico was governed by hedge funds. Now, one of the reasons their electrical utility system was so weak is because it was a bunch of hedge fund guys that were telling them what they could do. And now they aren't really governed at all. So what we're seeing is elite lawlessness. And monopoly is a form of lawlessness. And our public servants have no response. In the minds of our public officials, in our expectations for them, there's simply no belief anymore that political institutions or public institutions have any role to play in organizing power in the commercial arena. We're now in a world where we've all accepted that might makes right. It's funny, when you talk to members of Congress or senators, they're like, what do you want me to do? I'm just like a senator. I'm just a House, member of Congress. What can I do? They really think that. And so they occasionally write a mean letter. Now, everyone sees there's something really wrong with our culture. The Republicans saw Trump go through their primary and get rid of their 16 candidates, and then the Democrats saw Trump get rid of their candidate. But I want to focus on a slightly different part of the obvious chaos that we're seeing, which is the elite resistance to democracy. So in 2016, you saw both party platforms put something related to antitrust in their platforms. It was the first time since 1988. And the American Bar Association antitrust section noticed, but just said that the people are wrong. The section's view is that the nation's system of competition enforcement has been in good hands. Corporate concentration is not a problem. So this is what the bar is saying, that the people are wrong. They don't know what they're doing, both the Republicans and the Democrats. So the crisis is in the minds of our public officials and in the minds of the legal profession, because there is this belief that it is simply not legitimate for public institutions to structure and decentralize private power. So how did we get into this situation? I promise I'll get to the platforms. So the philosophy of the New Dealers lasted until basically the 70s. And people used to expect things out of their political system, and politicians used to wield power and deliver it, or try to deliver it. They expected to do that. People were citizens first and consumers second. There was an intellectual revolution in the 1970s. It was partly the law and economics, Olin Foundation. It was partly on the left. And Americans stopped being citizens in a commercial society and became consumers, voting with their dollars. Hence if you don't like Facebook, just don't use it. That's where that comes from. Now, why did this happen? It's a complicated story. But you saw basically two groups of planners on the left, and then the Chicago School planners on the right. And they united against the populism of the New Deal. So they didn't agree on the right amount of distribution, but they both agreed on a sort of planned economy, whether it was by monopolists or by technocrats. Both sides don't fundamentally believe in the use of public power to decentralize commercial power. And what this did, and there's a lot of ways to talk about it, but it moved legitimacy and power from public institutions to private ones. So you saw the change instantly in the 80s, and then it got worse over time. Leverage buyouts, media consolidation, defense consolidation, newly powerful things like chain stores, which existed, but they got much more powerful. This started in the 80s. It got much worse in the 90s and 2000s. So we saw institutions like Walmart emerge in this first revolution. But now we have layered a second revolution on top of this first one, and this is a digital revolution. The most obvious signposts of this are Amazon, Facebook, and Google. These are companies born native as digital operations, and they're born into a legal context arranged specifically in reaction to the New Deal. They were born as monopolies. So now we have these three companies as the pace setters in the economy and in politics. They control information and attention. They are politically powerful, and so forth. Now, these institutions are all different, but they share four common aspects. Each is a gatekeeper to key resources. Each engages in vertical integration up and down the supply chain, or sometimes out as a conglomerate, to acquire more power. Each has information asymmetry, so they know more about the market than anyone else in the market. And then each has political power. Now, I'm going to throw out a couple of sort of broad level solutions, because there are some that are obvious, although the how to actually do it is very complicated and we don't have all the ideas yet. But the first is no more mergers. They shouldn't be allowed to buy anyone. Google shouldn't have been allowed to buy DoubleClick or YouTube, AdMob. Facebook just bought a company, TBH. They shouldn't have been able to do that. They shouldn't have been able to buy Instagram and WhatsApp. And Amazon shouldn't have been able to buy Whole Foods. It's very easy to stop them from buying companies just on a practical level. The second solution is you got to make these platforms neutral. So they shouldn't be able to use their power as a platform to pick winners and losers. So this involves a number of things, and I might be mixing these up, but no discriminatory pricing, some form of algorithmic transparency, some sort of due process there, and then a separation of platforms in commerce. You shouldn't be able to compete on a platform you control. It's the essence of Glass-Steagall. It's the essence of a lot of structural separations that happened in the 30s. You need some sort of public access to data. It's outrageous that Mark Zuckerberg can just choose what to give our democracy about what happened in our elections. You need some sort of regulation of data based on consent and interoperability, some of the things that they're doing in Europe. But the key is to see that these are political institutions and that they have to be addressed on a political level, both domestically and internationally. So we need to, if we are going to address these institutions, recapture the attitude of New Dealers in how they approached power and democracy. So we need investigations all over the place just to understand these institutions. And then we need a recognition that the enforcement of antitrust has to move back towards an understanding that public power has to structure and decentralize private power. Big is bad, in other words. Now, I'm an optimist. There's a sort of tendency, I'm generally on the Democratic side of the aisle. There's a general sort of Eeyore mentality, like, a little pity laughing, I like that. But no, there's a general thing, oh, the sky is falling. But I'm not one of those people. I'm actually pretty optimistic. Americans don't like what's going on, and I think people around the world don't like what's going on. So they've been rebelling against this sort of Reaganite model for some time. They voted for change in 2006, 2008, 2010, 2014, and 2016. They're just not getting change, but they continue to vote for it. They will eventually get it, and hopefully it'll be the right kind of restoration of democracy. But since I am at Harvard Law, and you guys are going to become important people if you're not already, I will end with a statement on what it means to be a lawyer. Because to restore our democracy, we're going to need a different kind of lawyer. We're not the people that in the ABA section just said the people are wrong. We're going to need lawyers that understand that that's not what they're supposed to be doing. So one of Roosevelt's favorite lawyers was a guy I've been studying. His name is Robert Jackson. He's on the Supreme Court. And he started his political career putting Andrew Mellon, who was the Secretary of the Treasury, on trial for tax fraud. And then he went to the SEC. He defended New Deal programs before the Supreme Court. He led the antitrust division where he sought to break up Alcoa, which was a Mellon company. And in between these two episodes, he went to Nazi Germany in like 1935 to investigate a cartel. So he saw the Nazi state up close. And then he was a prosecutor at Nuremberg. And he was actually the last Supreme Court justice not to graduate from law school. He recognized, so because of that, he kind of saw the legal establishment in a specific way. He recognized that monopoly power had its analog in the corporate legal centers, which were emerging then, but today they're solidly established. Today, what we call big law. He saw both the need for a coherent legal establishment, but he also saw the dangers of the reactionary one that he faced in the 1930s and the New Deal faced. So America is led by lawyers. It always has been. And there's nothing in the Constitution that says that it has to be. Nothing that says that all the Supreme Court justices have to be lawyers, but they are, because Americans trust lawyers. I know, right? But you guys, as lawyers, as future lawyers, you have the ability to move us down one path or another. This is Harvard Law. It's an important institution. Today, when I'm in DC, lawyers trip over themselves to tell us why you can't use a law that was used to break up Standard Oil under a conservative Republican administration. You can't use that law to address Facebook or Google. Or corporate concentration is not a problem. Or the desire to protect democracy is just protectionism. That's what the conversation right now in the legal establishment is. And Robert Jackson would not have been surprised to see big law corporate lawyers reflecting the views of their clients. But he would have been disappointed in that, because he believed in lawyers, but he believed that lawyers were statesmen. I'm going to keep the gendered arrangement of that because it was the 1930s, but just acknowledge it. He said, "We believe in an independent bar, free not only from government control, but intellectually independent of client control. In the client and attorney relation, the client is not a master. The lawyer is not a mere hired hand. He is an officer of the court with a duty of independent judgment in the performance of his professional service and under a duty to serve all sorts and conditions of men." So he noted how terrible the bar was. Often. He was like, there are too many lawyers in the early 30s. Like, law schools are terrible. But he also said he would be disappointed if his son didn't join the bar. He was continually hopeful about the possibility for change, and he actually helped make that change happen during his lifetime. And I think we will too. I think we're on the verge of an intellectual revolution, because Google, Facebook, and Amazon, and also a lot of the concentrated institutions that are not as powerful but have emerged since the 80s, they present a fundamental challenge to our culture and a fundamental challenge to our democracy. They also very obviously reveal to people all over the spectrum and in business and in academia and in labor that the legal context in which we've been operating for decades needs to be reoriented. And American lawyers have to meet the challenge presented by these institutions. We must bring them into our constitutional order, because we will either govern them as a free people or they will govern us according to their needs and whims. So there you go. Those are my thoughts on breaking up the platforms and what it means to be a lawyer.
First theme I want to draw out is the role of big law in this monopoly power. You once said that, and I can say this because I will admit I am a Democrat, and you once said that the big law is the Democratic Party's deep state. And what did you?
I'm not. It makes me sound crazy. But I'm not.
What did you mean by that?
So if you looked at the Podesta emails and how, one of the things that they revealed that most people didn't focus on because it was the 2016 election, but they revealed how the Obama administration put their the White House and the important economic positions together, so the transition. And it was organized by Christine Varney, who was at one of these big law firms, and it was basically organized around putting people that were very comfortable with sort of planar technocracy. I don't think these are bad people, by the way. I just think they have a specific view in which bigness is good. Putting them into key positions, sort of the key money positions at Treasury and the antitrust agencies at the FTC, and other places. And that's kind of, if you think about how one of the things that happened in the 50s, and I'm trying to figure out why it happened, but this split between politics and economics took place, and so people are experts in running political races, but then stand aside and let the adults take over and govern. And the adults don't really care what happened in those elections. They don't see them as transferring information to the governing system. They just, like the ABA antitrust section report, they're like, they're just wrong. They don't know anything. And they don't see any meaning in elections. So those people live in kind of these big law these big law partnerships, it's kind of a metaphor for that type of cultural institution. I'm not opposed to all these big law firms. I'm just, the ideology that lives within them, though, I think is pretty anti-democratic.
Yeah, I looked into the ABA report, and 14 of the 19 writers of it were connected to these corporate interest law firms. So it's not that the ABA is always representing all the different interests. A second question that's a little more complicated for progressives is, when you're opposed to bigness, you're also opposed to some ideas on the left, or you're skeptical
Right.
of some ideas on the left. And so there's proposals for bigness on the left, say, keep Amazon, keep the control, but nationalize it. Or a former Harvard Law Forum speaker, Matt Brunig, wants to have a national fund, and you refer to that as continuing the financialization, even if it's democratized the benefits of it. What is the debate of bigness on the left?
It goes back to the election of 1912, and it sort of continued until today. But there's basically three philosophies of how to run an industrial state. The first was, I guess, Taft's philosophy, where he said just let the big titans do what they want because they know what they're doing. The second was Teddy Roosevelt, who said, put public power on top of concentrated private power. These monopolies are just natural. They're just more efficient. And the third was Wilson, who said there shouldn't be concentrations of power. So there was have private masters, public masters, or no masters. It's kind of like the way to think about it. And this debate in the New Deal was, you had the Bull Moose Teddy Roosevelt guys. It's like Adolf Berle, and then you had the Brandeisians. Brandeis was a Wilson advisor, and they fought throughout the New Deal, and that fight continued. And so what you see with today, you can see it with like overt socialists like Matt, and his wholesale adoption of our concentrated financial structure. He's just like, make it public, right, and distribute the goods broadly. Or you can see it with I think the Obama administration had a lot of that, which is like Dodd-Frank and the ACA were both about taking very concentrated industrial structures and putting some public regulations on them. And they both really come out of this sort of Teddy Roosevelt philosophy of how to organize a society, the idea that big is good. And sometimes there are economies of scale, but Wilson and Brandeis and Jackson and various others thought that was a threat. Bigness was a threat to our rights as a free people.
Thanks for that. Let's open it up to the audience. Right there. Start.
Hi, yeah. So my question is just, to what extent do you think Europe provides a solution to some of these issues? And that, like, obviously Europe has been more active in taking action against these platforms, and particularly Google, in a way that I think wouldn't be politically palatable in the US, even if it were legally possible. And so the European antitrust action against Google, and also the discussions around the right to forget and the implications that has for digital companies like Google and Facebook, obviously provide some constraint on their actions in Europe. Do you think that crosses over to the US in any way and provides a constraint on their action at all in the US?
Yeah, so, by the way, what's your name?
Oh, sorry, I'm Johanna.
So does everyone know what's going on in Europe, or I'm going to just explain it really quickly. So I'll just take one slice of it. So Margaret Vestager, who's the competition head in Europe, is suing Google, saying that they need to provide equal treatment for all comers onto their search engine. A different group, the European data regulators, are saying that if you are a platform, or if you have data on someone and you want to use that data to target them, that you have to get consent. So my relationship with Pete, if Facebook knows about that and they want to use that to target me, I have to let them do that. What this does is it changes the nature of who gets to monetize that relationship. And the publishers are very excited because they perceive these platforms as monetizing the relationships that they've built with trusted information. I happen to think that what they're doing in Europe is really interesting. I'm really curious to see what happens. In 2018, the data regs are going to kick in, and so we'll see. My guess is that the platforms are going to try to sabotage it any way that they can. They're not going nearly as far as they need to, so Vestager's nowhere near as aggressive as she should be. but they're doing something, and I think that's going to have massive impacts here. I also don't think it's not politically viable to do it here. I think people just say that because it's like pretty obvious when you have things like Equifax that no one wants to do anything in any way. But like we just elected Donald Trump, right? Like anything's possible, right?
Other questions?
Oh wait.
Do you right there?
Yeah, thanks a lot for your talk. So, one of the, as you must have heard of this, one of the arguments against breaking up this network economies like Google, Facebook, and Amazon is that the difference from the companies that we have to deal with for the New Deal because of the network economy, in that if my use of Facebook depends on your use of Facebook, and it's very inefficient to have like say 10 different social networks on there. So in that sense, it's how do you think of a break up Facebook given the nature of this network economy?
That's a really important question, and there are lots of there might be a natural monopoly around certain parts of these institutions. So when I say break up, it doesn't necessarily mean sort of chop it up into 7 pieces. It could mean something like Glass-Steagall, which separated lines of business, or what they did, the Air Mail Act in '34 to separate airplane makers from airlines themselves. So interoperability would be a way that you could organize not a breakup, but some sort of reduction of power for Facebook. But there are definite, like if you think about them as platforms and you say you need to apply some sort of public utility or common carriage rules to them, you also could combine that with what are they called? Quarantining. So you might want to split up parts of Google that don't need to be connected, even if some of them are natural monopolies and do have network effects. But then to the extent that you can, you really do want to reduce their power. So if you can break them up, you should. But this is why you have to investigate carefully and figure out what you can do.
So you're more talking about power and vertical chains that horizontal direction.
Yeah, I mean, I don't know how to think about vertical and horizontal in the context of data is kind of one of the problems. But yeah. Right there.
Thank you. You mentioned merger enforcement or the lack thereof under the Obama administration. I'd be interested in hearing your thoughts on what you see merger enforcement taking place under the Trump administration being, especially given some of his campaign statements, such as on the AT&T Time Warner merger, and then also if federal agencies aren't going to be as active in merger enforcement as maybe they should be, do you see state AGs as a potential avenue for increased merger enforcement?
So first one, I have no idea. Make and Delrahim just got confirmed. I don't know what he's going to do. They just put a new FTC slate up. I don't know what they're going to do. We'll see. And yes, I think you'll see increased activity by state level. There's right now in the political establishment, there's a kind of learning curve about antitrust. People don't really understand it or care about it, or they haven't for a really long time, and now they're starting to say, hey, these big companies are a thing. So they're learning, and that takes a while.
Any final words, Matt, before we close out for today?
No, I mean, thanks for coming, and focus on where the money is. That's like where power is. It's pretty simple, but like, if you're not thinking about big money, you're not really, there are important fights everywhere, but like, there aren't a lot of people that are really thinking about social justice in the context of big money.
Let's keep it